My last I did a history of Batman in film. Well, I also wanted to do a history of Superman in film as well. Superman is pretty much the reason we got the modern superhero. We owe a lot to Superman, and I think doing a history of would be interesting. Mainly because Superman has had a lot of adaptations and canceled films, just like Batman. Personally, I think Batman has more, but we'll see. So sit back and learn about the history of Superman in film. First things first are the film serials, the first of which was called Superman in 1948. Our hero is played by Kirk Allen, but to sell the superhero ness of the character, he was just credited as Superman himself. Kind of funny. Noelle Neal is our Lois Lane, and she will come into play a little bit later as well. The first villain that the Man of Steel fought against on film, just like the Batman serial, is one purely made for the film. She goes by Spider Lady, and she's played by Carol Foreman. Nothing of interest here, so moving on to Atom Man vs. Superman in 1950. Allen and Neal reprised their roles as Superman and Lois Lane. We also have another character purely made for the film, Atom Man. Or is he? It turns out that the villain of this picture is actually Lex Luthor, played by Lyle Talbot. For some reason, the supervillain has an alter ego. I'm not sure why, but I haven't seen it, so maybe there's a concrete reason for it. Probably not, though, because nobody gave a shit back then. Moving on. Next, we have Superman vs. the Mole Men, which is the film that birthed the Adventures of Superman TV series with George Reeves. Phyllis Coates is our Lois Lane here, and she proceeded to be Lois Lane in the first season of the TV show, only to be replaced by Noelle Neal in the later seasons due to scheduling conflicts. The Mole Men are the villains here that are made purely for the film and don't offer anything interesting. I guess you could say this film is very much overshadowed by the series that succeeded it, as it is more noteworthy and well known more, unlike Batman the movie, which more so shares its success with the TV show that succeeded it rather than being overshadowed by it. After George Reeves' death in 1959, producers weren't very sure where to bring the character next. Many people considered soft rebooting Adventures of Superman into Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, and using over the shoulder shots with Superman's stunt double and using stock footage of Reeves. However, Jack Larson, the guy who played Jimmy Olsen, hated the idea, and that was the end of that. A Super Boy show and a Super Pup show, don't ask, were also commissioned but didn't get picked up. In 1966, however, we got our next adaptation of Superman in the form of a Broadway musical called It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman. Yes, I am dead serious here, and it was nominated for 3 Tony Awards too. I wish I was making this up. Why am I mentioning this? Well, it was made into a TV movie in 1975, 3 years before the more famous Superman adaptation. Let's just say the less said about this thing, the better. Trust me. Moving on to good Superman films, we have the most famous Superman movie of them all, Superman the movie starring Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder as Superman and Lois Lane respectively. Gene Hackman is our villain with Lex Luthor, and he does a good job, despite a rather dated performance. This movie, despite a dated look, is timeless in performances, themes, story, and music. It is pretty much the go-to in terms of Superman, so much so that the fans can't let it the fuck go, for better or for worse. Superman, and along with its sequel, Superman 2, were attempted to be filmed back to back by Richard Donner, long before Lord of the Rings. However, the producers forced Donner to finish the first film and fast track it to release, hence why we got that god awful ending, which was supposed to be saved for its sequel. Despite this, we got a great and solid film that shall be remembered as the first real comic book movie. So, despite the fact that Donner did a great job with the first Superman film and about 75 to 95% of the second movie was completed, he was booted in favor of Hard Day's Night director Richard Lester. He reshot most of the movie so that he can get his name on it. However, just some Donner footage was still used. I would also like to point out something. That stupid memory wiping kiss at the end of the movie, yes, that was all Lester, so blame him for that stupid fucking shit. Overall, this film is tonally inconsistent and way too campy. While the first film has that dated 70s look, it still is a solid movie and timeless with its story and characters. This film just hypes up the camp way too much. Terrence Stamp's performance is hilariously over the top and very enjoyable to watch, though. But unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons. The only reason this film doesn't suck is the fact that Donner still kind of had his stamp on it. We wouldn't get his original vision of the film until 26 years after this film came out. But hey, if you want a fully Lester shitfest, we'll get to that in a minute. For our first kind of cancelled Superman film was the original idea for Superman 3. Initially, producer, let's hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Elias Salkind had written a treatment for it, and it was supposed to be more cosmic than the final product. It was supposed to have Supergirl, Brainiac, and Mr. Mxyzptlk. Brainiac and Supergirl were supposed to have like a father-daughter relationship, and Supergirl was supposed to be a love interest for Superman, despite being cousins in the comics. However, WB wanted something totally different instead, which is the film we got. Supergirl would get her own god-awful film a year later, and neither Brainiac nor Mr. Mxyzptlk have been used in a big-budget film yet. However, Dudley Moore was considered for the role of Mxyzptlk, and was supposed to be a more seriously toned character than his sillier comic book counterpart. Also, allegedly, Richard Pryor was considered for Brainiac before being the tech guy in the final product. While I would have preferred to see this version, I'm not sure how a Pryor handled Brainiac would be. Instead, we got this Superman 3 instead, which is all Lester, and guess what? It sucks big time. However, the major thing is, this film is entirely forgettable other than some really unfunny scenes with Richard Pryor and maybe one or two other scenes. I think Lana Lang was in there somewhere too. Brainiac was changed into quote unquote evil supercomputer that Pryor's character had worked on before turning to the side of good. Our main villain is a guy named Ross Webster, played by Robert Vaughn. There was also an evil Superman and a good Clark Kent. The only thing I actually remember from this pile of shit is that this really stupid scene where Superman flicks nuts at whiskey bottles.
Hey, 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 come on. Just leave him alone.
My god, is this movie fucking bad. But believe it or not, it gets worse because after this film, Golden Globus bought the rights and produced the next Superman film, and my god, is it the perfect travesty. Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. The canon-made Superman film. The only reason Reeves signed on to do this movie was because he believed in the message against nuclear weapons. Yeah, pretty stupid. Remember, kids, don't go into a film solely for a cause because you're going to be making a movie for all the wrong reasons. Paul Feig, I'm looking at you. Anyway, this time the villain is made purely for the film and is Nuclear Man, played by Mark Pillow and voiced by Gene Hackman. There's also John Cryer in the movie for some reason. This movie is really dumb and really bad. So bad, in fact, that it pretty much cursed the Superman franchise for 19 years, and it took an extra 7 to get a good Superman movie. But we'll get to that little gem eventually. Overall, bad film, and less said about this, the better. I'm really saying that a lot. However, before Superman 4 failed, Cannon wanted to make a fifth film with Albert Puin as director. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This is the man that would later be responsible for the 1990 Captain America movie. Yeah, thank God that didn't happen. However, because of Cannon's bankruptcy, the rights went back to the Salkinds. They were ready to fast track a sequel called Superman the New Movie. It was going to be about Superman dying and being resurrected in the shrunken, bottled Kryptonian city of Kandor. Pretty interesting, and even more interesting for the fact that it would have predated Death of Superman by a few years. In terms of casting, Reeve would have been set to return. Nothing else is known about characters or story, though. The next cancelled film is Superman Reborn. Warner Brothers purchased the rights from the Salkinds in 1993 in hopes of making an adaptation of the Death of Superman storyline. Jonathan Lemkin wrote the script, and it would have focused on the relationship of Lois Lane and Superman and the battle with Doomsday, similar to the comic. However, here's where it gets weird. In the script, apparently, when Superman would have professed his love for Lois Lane, his life force would have jumped in between them when he died, giving Lois Lane a virgin birth. And people say the Jesus symbolism in Man of Steel is bad. So then, their child would have grown to the age of 21 in 3 weeks and then would have stopped Doomsday. WB didn't like the script, not because of the weird virgin birth crap, but because they found it too similar to the themes of Batman Forever. Gregory Poirier? Why doesn't anybody have a fucking normal name? Was hired to rewrite the script. In the script, Brainiac would have created Doomsday infused with kryptonite blood. Apparently, Clark and Lois would have been going through relationship struggles before he was killed by Doomsday. An alien named Cadmus, very different from its comic book counterpart, was a victim of Brainiac and steals Superman's corpse. Cadmus brings him back to life to defeat Brainiac. Superman has to wear a robotic suit until his powers return, and according to the script, his powers would have been a mental discipline called Finyar. At the producer's request, Superman would have been in an all black suit by the end of the film. Parasite and Silver Banshee also would have made appearances. Apparently, this fucked up bastardized bullshit of the Superman mythos impressed WB, but Kevin Smith was hired to rewrite. He threw out the script saying it did not respect the Superman mythos properly. That is an understatement. With Smith now on board, this project then morphed into the most famous Superman cancelled film of them all. Tim Burton's Superman Lives. I'm not going to go into specifics with this film because there is so much shit in regards to this film that I cannot cover it, or else this video would be an hour long. If you want info on this film, just watch the documentary The Death of Superman Lives, because that'll give you all the info you could possibly want on this film. Pretty much, it would have adapted the death of Superman, but adding a lot more shit than the comic book story. Nicolas Cage was set to be Superman. Sandra Bullock, Courtney Cox, and Julianne Moore were contenders for Lois Lane. Kevin Spacey was considered for Lex Luthor, and Christopher Walken, Jim Carrey, and Gary Oldman were all considered for Brainiac. Chris Rock was set to be Jimmy Olsen, and Michael Keaton was supposed to have a cameo, presumably as Bruce Wayne, but not Batman, because when asked if he would appear in the film as Batman, he said, quote unquote, not exactly. So people assume that it would have been Bruce Wayne. Plus, a bunch of other behind the scenes crap too. As I stated, just watch Death of Superman Lives. You'll know the full scoop. Over a decade later, though, WB considered for a while to make an animated version of the script with Cage voicing Superman, but nothing has come into fruition. Next up in the early 2000s is Batman vs. Superman. I already went over this film in my previous history of, so if you want more info on that, just go back to that video. If you want plot specifics, check out Mr. Sunday Movie's video about it. He goes through the entire plot and goes through the specifics of it. It's just as bad as you think it is. Okay, this is a long one. Long story short, though, Batman vs. Superman was shit canned for our next film, J.J. Abrams' Superman Flyby. In all honesty, though, I think Abrams was having an off week when he wrote this pile of shit. So, the plot went like this. First things first, Krypton never blows up. Instead, Kal-El is rocketed to Earth because of a civil war between his father Jor-El and Jor-El's brother Katazor, who was specifically made for the film. And Jor-El thought Kal would be fulfilling a prophecy. So, Cal is adopted by the Kents, and when he grows up, gets a job at the Daily Planet. He forms a romance with Lois Lane, but she's focusing on exposing Lex Luthor, who is a tinfoil hat wearing government agent. Kent reveals himself to the world as Superman, which brings Katazor's son Tyzor to Earth along with three unnamed Kryptonians. Superman is eventually killed by Tyzor and meets Jor-El in Kryptonian heaven as Jor-El committed suicide while in prison. He comes back to life, defeats the Kryptonians, and at the end of the film heads off to Krypton in a spaceship. There were also drafts of the script that had Lex Luthor be a Kryptonian sleeper agent, as well as Superman having to learn Kryptonian Kung Fu. Yeah, kind of run of the mill dumb script. McGee and Brett Ratner were considered to direct. Ratner wanted Josh Hartnett, Jude Law, Paul Walker, and Brendan Fraser for the role, but none of them wanted to sign on. David Boreanaz, Victor Webster, and Ashton Kutcher all auditioned for the role of Superman. James Marsden stated that he was also approached by Ratner to be in the role, despite being Cyclops at the time. Matt Bomer was also a major contender and Ratner's favorite for the role. Joel Edgerton turned down the role in favor of being the villain Tyzor. Ratner also wanted Anthony Hopkins for Jor-El and Ray Fiennes as Lex Luthor. Christopher Walken was also in talks to be Perry White. Kerry Russell during this time auditioned for the role of Lois Lane. However, due to casting delays and feuds with producer John Peters, if you remember him from last time, he was trying to get Return of the Batman, the late 1970s Batman film, off the ground, Ratner dropped out to be replaced by McGee. McGee wanted Shia LaBeouf for Jimmy Olsen, an unknown as Superman, Scarlett Johansson as Lois Lane, and Johnny Depp for Lex Luthor, even though in an interview many years later, McGee stated that Robert Downey Jr. had been cast as Lex Luthor. McGee began to shoot test footage with Jason Barrett, Henry Cavill, Jared Padalecki, and Michael Cassidy. While not stated, Brandon Routh also shot test footage, as a photo of it eventually leaked to the internet along with a picture of Cavill's test footage. There were complications where to film, as McGee wanted it to be in the US, but WB wanted it to be in Australia. McGee later dropped out because of this and to his fear of flying. Due to all this nonsense, Abrams wanted to try and get a chance to direct the script, but due to the fact that he was a nobody in directing at the time, they rejected him in favor of Bryan Singer. Because of this, the project then morphed into our next film, Superman Returns. Bryan Singer signed on to do a Superman movie and basically threw out Abrams' script and started fresh and new. He was a huge fan of the Donner film growing up as well as its sequel. He abandoned directorial duties for X-Men 3, which would later ironically go to Ratner, and a remake of Logan's Run. He wanted to make an alternate sequel to Superman 2 and have the first Superman film, as well as its sequel, serve as backstory for this film, ignoring the events of Superman 3 and 4. In this version, Kal leaves Earth to look for survivors of Krypton and comes back 5 years later to find that Lois Lane has a son and is engaged and that the world has forgotten him. Singer brought on unknown Brandon Routh for the role, who, as I stated, auditioned for Flyby, but bringing A-list stars like Kevin Spacey for Lex Luthor and Frank Langella for Perry White. Kate Bosworth was cast as Lois Lane, and she was not a very good Lois Lane. It's a rather mediocre film, but has some interesting themes with Superman's character, despite being a rather boring film for most of the running time. Before this film was released, though, WB announced a sequel to this film with everyone returning and Singer coming back to direct. However, like a lot of these films, that sequel never saw the light of day, but we'll get to that in a sec. I'm kind of cheating with this next pick since this was never released in theaters, but it's using footage that was, so I'll still technically count it. Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut, which is, to me, the best Superman film we've ever gotten, despite some flaws. This is a recut version using all of Donner's original footage, as well as some screen test footage and Lester footage to pad out the scenes that never got filmed by Donner. It pretty much has all of the themes and intrigue of the first film, but has more interesting villains that match Superman in brawn and even more so in brains. It's a fairly interesting watch for any Superman fan. Moving on to the cancelled sequel for Superman Returns, which Singer stated would have been titled Superman the Man of Steel, or simply Man of Steel. Everyone was set to reprise their roles, and WB stated that they wanted to make the film more action oriented to make room for the younger male crowd, as Singer stated that Superman Returns was made more so with a female audience in mind. Singer wanted the villain to be Darkseid, but the writer Michael Dougherty wanted Brainiac for the villain. There were also reports of Bizarro being used as well. So Dougherty stated that Kryptonians probably would have made colonies off planet and wanted to explore that idea of Kryptonians out there that weren't on Krypton. He also wanted to explore the ideas of these villains not being evil right off the bat, and slowly becoming these villains as they adapt to Earth. These ideas would later be explored in Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. However, WB halted the production in 2007, wanting a Justice League film instead. This would become George Miller's Justice League Mortal, which eventually got cancelled as well, but I'll get to that in a minute. Long story short, Singer went off to do Valkyrie, while WB fast-tracked Mortal and got Miller on the project. This project eventually fell through, and Singer came back to work on a return sequel, but with Routh's contract expiring, the 2009 release date coming up with no script, and Singer starting to lose interest, the project got shelved. However, there was allegedly a leaked synopsis that gave a rough outline of the film. Pretty much, it would have involved Brainiac coming to Earth in a Kryptonian ship with a bunch of his clones on board with him. In this version, Brainiac wanted to perfect Earth so that it would be destroyed, and Superman would find out that Brainiac is responsible for the death of his homeworld. In the climax, Superman destroys the ship with all his clones, and Brainiac would be searching for a Kryptonian body to hold him, which was the reason for said clones, and turns to Superman's son Jason. Upon jumping into his son's body, he would become a fully grown man, and Superman has to fight his own son, trying to figure out if he can get him back. However, when he realizes he can't, he is forced to kill his son to stop Brainiac's reign. There was a great video by Cut Short if you want to know more plot specifics. Link will be below. Yeah, so that's pretty fucking grim for a Superman film, but it was only a leaked synopsis, so who knows if that's what the film would have been like. Mainly because I remember in the first film, which is now canon in this universe, it was it wasn't it like the sun was gonna explode or something, and that's why he was sent to Earth. So retconning that, and it, I don't know. I don't really trust this synopsis, but it's the closest we have in terms of what maybe the film would have been like. Just a short little tidbit about Justice League Mortal. While I did speak of this in the last history of, I did more so focus on Batman, so here I'll focus on Superman. Of course. So obviously Mortal was supposed to be in a separate continuity from Returns, and Brendan Routh wasn't asked to be Superman in this film. The role would be filled by actor DJ Catrona. In this version, Superman is pretty similar to his comic incarnation, with being the big blue Boy Scout and being a morally grounded character. In the extended climax of the film, Superman would have been possessed by Maxwell Lord in an attempt to kill Wonder Woman. Sorry, in an injustice sort of way. It's well written, and I'm sure Catrona would have done a good job in the role. As I stated, this was eventually canned because of the writer's strike, WB not wanting multiple Batman on screen, and at the same time, and another reason I just learned, is that the Australian Film Commission denied WB their 40% tax rebate. With this, they pulled the plug on the film. As I stated before, go watch Cut Short's video on it. It's really good. However, upon reading the script in between these videos, I realized he did get some plot details wrong, but despite that, it's still a good video. So finally, we get to Man of Steel and the unofficial Superman trilogy. Ideas for this started pretty much when Mortal and the Return sequel got canned. During the pre-production for The Dark Knight, the shit guzzler himself, David S. Goyer, knew that WB was planning a reboot of the Superman franchise and confronted Christopher Nolan about it. Nolan offered an idea on how to do a Superman film in a modern context, as well as a concept from Goyer. Impressed with their ideas, Goyer was hired to write and Nolan was hired to produce. Zack Snyder was eventually hired in 2010 to direct the film. Other directors considered were Duncan Jones, Darren Aronofsky, who famously worked on the canceled Batman Year One project, Jonathan Liebsman, Matt Reeves, who would become the director of the upcoming Batman solo movie, Tony Scott, and Ben Affleck, future Batman. Guillermo del Toro turned down the film to work on his eventual canceled project, an adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft story At the Mountains of Madness. It took 3 years to make, and we got Man of Steel, which reintroduced the character in modern times similar to Batman Begins. As I stated before, it did reuse Michael Dougherty's ideas for the sequel to Superman Returns, but I'm not sure if this was on purpose or just pure coincidence. It had a great box office, earning $668 million, but lukewarm receptions from critics and audiences. Michael Shannon is our villain, General Zod, and he does a way better job than Stamp did in the original. Despite the fact that Stamp's performance is very enjoyable, he's still very one-dimensional. I want to take over the world. Why? Because I can, that's why! Shannon's performance is realistic, grounded, and much more interesting despite some over-the-top acting in certain areas. Russell Crowe, who played Jor-El in the film, went on to state that a Superman trilogy was in the works first, but got scrapped due to the mixed reception. It was because of this that Snyder reworked his Superman trilogy into the movies that followed. Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice was the next film announced in the DCEU. Ben Affleck was cast as Batman, with hatred and a big backlash from fans, as well as Gal Gadot being cast as Wonder Woman, with another big backlash from fans. Jesse Eisenberg and Jeremy Irons were cast as Lex Luthor and Alfred Pennyworth. It was set to come out in 2015, but then postponed it to 2016 to give everyone more time to work on the film. According to many sources, WB execs viewed a 4-hour rough cut of the film and gave it a standing ovation and Ben Affleck a three-picture deal. Despite this, they forced Zack Snyder to cut down the film majorly, even cutting key scenes and making the film less coherent. It was released to overwhelming negative reception, however Affleck and Gadot were praised despite the initial backlash. It continued Superman's role in the world and doubting whether or not he should be able to help people in a world that doesn't want him. It develops the character well and is a great juxtaposition to Affleck's Batman, who is a grizzled loner and a veteran of the superhero journey. The ultimate cut was eventually released, putting 30 minutes back into the film, making a more interesting and coherent product. Clark Kent is used more so in this version, and more so than any previous version of the character. Ignoring Smallville, of course, I meant Clark Kent and Superman simultaneously, him being the reporter and whatnot. Okay, moving on. With that, we have our final film, which is the much-awaited Justice League, which I talked about previously. Superman only comes in about halfway through the film, actually not even halfway through the film, more like two-thirds into the film, with weird-ass Jay Leno face, thanks to some shoddy CGI to shop out his mustache, even though it makes more fucking sense to put on a fake mustache than to waste money on unnecessary CGI, but I digress. Despite the god-awful CGI, Superman in this film is more so a return to form than Cavill's portrayal in the previous films, being the more light-hearted version of the character and having an even brighter costume than before. He's pretty much the Deus Ex Machina of the film, but it was nice to see Cavill in the role and have his 3-movie story arc completed. Now, the only other project left is Man of Steel 2, or the upcoming Superman solo film. Henry Cavill and Amy Adams, who I pretty much forgot to mention this entire time, mainly because she's such a forgettable character that I don't give a shit, I assume are going to reprise their roles. Unlike the upcoming Batman solo film, which has already gotten a shit ton of history and behind the scenes crap, this one doesn't. The only major things attributed to this film is that Amy Adams confirmed a screenplay was being written and that Matthew Vaughn is the biggest contender to direct. However, after Kingsman and the Golden Circle having mixed to negative reception, might not go with that choice. We'll just have to wait and see. Fingers crossed for Brad Bird. Please. So, that was my history on Superman. Now that the two biggest comic book heroes have a history of, mainly due to all the shit ton of adaptations, what's next? Well, I didn't plan on doing another one, but I might consider doing the rest of the Justice League history of, with doing the rest of the characters in mini history ofs like Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, so on and so forth, and what adaptations they've had over the years, but in one big special since none of them have really had a shit ton like Batman and Superman. So, that would probably be the best course of action. However, I might consider doing some Marvel heroes as well. You'll just have to wait and see.